Brought to you by Penguin.
PostCapitalism, A Guide to Our Future. Written and read by Paul Mason. Introduction. To find the River Dniester, we drive through cold woodlands, past decomposing flats and rail yards where the dominant colour is rust. The freezing water runs clear. It is so quiet that you can hear little pieces of concrete falling off the road bridge above as it slowly crumbles through neglect. The Dniester is the geographic border between free market capitalism and whatever you want to call the system Vladimir Putin runs. It separates Moldova, a country in Eastern Europe, from a breakaway Russian puppet state called Transnistria, controlled by the mafia and secret police. On the Moldovan side, elderly people squat on the pavements selling stuff they've grown or made, cheese, pastries, a few turnips. Young people are scarce. 1 in 4 adults works abroad. Half the population earns less than $5 a day. 1 in 10 lives in a poverty so extreme it can be measured on the same scale as Africa's. The country was born at the start of the neoliberal era, with the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s and the entry of market forces. But many of the villagers I talked to would rather live in Putin's police state than in the disgraceful penury of Moldova. This grey world of dirt roads and grim faces was produced by capitalism, not communism, and now capitalism is already past its best. Moldova, of course, is not a typical European country, but it's in these edge places of the world that we can watch the economic tide receding and trace the causal links between stagnation, social crisis, armed conflict, and the erosion of democracy. The economic failure of the West is eroding belief in values and institutions that we once thought were permanent. In the financial centres behind plate glass, things can still look rosy. Since 2008, trillions of dollars of confected money have flowed through the banks, hedge funds, law firms and consultancies to keep the global system functioning. But the long-term prospects for capitalism are bleak. According to the OECD, growth in the developed world will be quote-unquote weak for the next 50 years. Inequality will rise by 40%. Even in the developing countries, the current dynamism will be exhausted by 2060. The OECD's economists were too polite to say it, so let's spell it out. For the developed world, the best of capitalism is behind us, and for the rest, it will be over in our lifetime. What started in 2008 as an economic crisis morphed into a social crisis, leading to mass unrest, and now as revolutions turn into civil wars, creating military tension between nuclear superpowers, it has become a crisis of the global order. There are, on the face of it, only 2 ways it can end. In the first scenario, the global elite clings on, imposing the cost of crisis onto workers, pensioners and the poor over the next 10 or 20 years. The global order, as enforced by the IMF, World Bank and the World Trade Organization, survives, but in a weakened form. The cost of saving globalization is borne by the ordinary people of the developed world, but growth stagnates. In the second scenario, the consensus breaks. Parties of the hard right and left come to power as ordinary people refuse to pay the price of austerity. Instead, states then try to impose the costs of the crisis on each other. Globalization falls apart, the global institutions become powerless, and in the process, the conflicts that have burned these past 20 years, drug wars, post-Soviet nationalism, jihadism, uncontrolled migration, and resistance to it, light a fire at the centre of the system. In this scenario, lip service to international law evaporates. Torture, censorship, arbitrary detention, and mass surveillance become the regular tools of statecraft. This is a variant of what happened in the 1930s, and there is no guarantee it cannot happen again. In both scenarios, the serious impacts of climate change, demographic aging, and population...
Sample complete.
Ready to continue?